Stage 6, Pilgrim's Progress. Now when they almost passed through this wilderness, Faithful happened to look behind at the way they had come, and spotted someone coming after them. He recognized the man, but asked Christian to be sure his eyes weren't playing tricks. "Who is that coming after us?" Christian looked and said, "It's my good friend, Evangelist." "Yes, and my good friend too," said Faithful, "for it was he who directed me to the way that leads to the gate." With that, Evangelist walked up and joined them. He said, "Peace be with you, dearly beloved, and may there be peace to those who have helped you." Christian clapped his friend on the back. "Welcome, welcome, my good Evangelist. Just seeing you again reminds me of all your earlier kindnesses and tireless efforts for my eternal good." "Yes, 1,000 times welcome," Faithful said. "Oh, sweet Evangelist, how desirable is your fellowship to us poor pilgrims." Evangelist offered them a broad smile. "How have you fared, my friends, since the last time I saw you? What have you encountered, and how have you behaved yourselves?" Christian and Faithful told him about all the things that had happened to them along the way, including the many difficulties they had endured up to this point in their travels. "How glad I am to hear it," Evangelist said. "Not glad that you have met with trials, but that you have proven yourselves to be victors over them. And for this reason, despite your many weaknesses, you have been enabled to continue in the way to this very day. I can't tell you enough about how well pleased I am about this, for my own sake and yours. I have sown and you have reaped. The day is coming when he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. That is, if you hold out to the end. For in due time you shall reap if you do not grow weary. The crown of reward is before you, and it is an incorruptible one. So run in a way that you may obtain it." Some people have set out for this crown, but after they have gone a great distance, another comes in and takes it from them. You are not yet out of the gunshot range of the devil, for you have not yet resisted to the point of blood as you strive against sin. Let the kingdom always be before you, and without wavering, believe regarding the things that are invisible. Let nothing in this world come between you and the crown. Above all, pay attention to your own hearts with their lusts, for they are deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Set your faces with flint-like resolve, since you have all power in heaven and on earth on your side. Christian thanked him for his counsel and encouragement, but added that he and Faithful desired him to speak to them more, for they hoped for something helpful to take them the rest of the way. For they knew very well that he was a prophet, and that he could tell them about things that might happen to them, as well as how they might resist and overcome them. So Evangelist agreed and said, "My sons, you have heard in the word of the truth of the gospel that you must go through many tribulations to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And again, that in every city bonds and afflictions await you. For this reason, you can't expect to travel far on your pilgrimage without encountering them in one way or another. You have already experienced a measure of this truth, and more will immediately follow. For now, as you see, you are almost out of this wilderness. You will soon arrive at a town that you will see directly in front of you. In that town you will be severely assaulted by enemies who will make every attempt to kill you. You may be sure that one or both of you will seal the testimony you hold with blood. In spite of this, be faithful unto death, and the king will give you a crown of life. Whoever dies there, although his death will be unnatural and his pain great, yet he will have an advantage over his companion. First of all, he will arrive at the celestial city sooner, but secondly, he will also escape many miseries that the other will meet with during the rest of his journey. But when you arrive at this town and all that I have related to you comes to pass, then remember your friend and behave like men, and entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Then I saw in my dream that when Christian and Faithful got out of the wilderness, they immediately saw a town before them, and the name of that town was Vanity. In that town is promoted a fair called Vanity Fair. It is held all year long, and it is called Vanity Fair because of the name of the town. For the town is brighter than vanity, and also because all that is sold there and all who come there are worthless. As the saying of the wise says, all this world promotes is vanity. This fair is not a newly erected business, but is actually an ancient enterprise. Let me tell you about its origins. Almost 5,000 years ago, there were pilgrims walking to the celestial city, just like faithful and Christian are doing. So Beelzebub, Apollyon, and Legion, with their associates, perceived by seeing the path made by the pilgrims on their way to the city that the course lay through this town of vanity. They planned to set up a fair here, a fair at which all sorts of vanity could be sold amid festivities open and ongoing the whole year. Therefore at this fair they sell such merchandise as houses, land, trades, places, honors, promotions, titles, countries, kingdoms, lusts, and pleasures of all sorts, including things such as harlots, wives, husbands, children, masters, servants, lives, blood, bodies, souls, silver, gold, pearls, precious stones, and much more. And along with all this, at this fair there is constant round-the-clock entertainment, like juggling, cheats, games, plays, clowns, mimics, tricksters, and rogues, and other amusements of every kind. Here visitors can also find free offers that include thefts, murders, adulteries, perjuries, and all of them are available in various shades of a blood-red color. As in other fairs of less importance, there are several lanes and streets with representative names, where certain categories of merchandise are marketed. In the same way, at this fair you have the proper places, lanes, and streets, which bear names of countries and kingdoms. It is in these places that the goods of this fair are easily found. There is the Britain row, the French row, the Italian row, the Spanish row, the German row, all of which offer a variety of vanities for sale. But just like other fairs, where one commodity dominates the market, here too the most sought after of all the fair is the merchandise of Rome, for it is greatly promoted. Some like our English nation, and others have taken a dislike for this huckstering. Now, as I said, the way to the celestial city lies through this town, with its lusty fair, which is held year-round. Those who think they are going to avoid this city will still have to go out of the world. The Prince of Princes himself, when he was here, passed through this town on his way to his own country, during a time when the fair was in full operation. I believe it was Beelzebub, the chief lord of this fair, who invited him to buy some of his vanities. Yes, he would have made him lord of this fair, if only he would have shown him reverence and bowed to him as he went through the town. Plus, because he was such a person of honor, Beelzebub escorted him from street to street and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a brief amount of time, so that he might, if possible, lure that blessed one to lower himself and buy some of his vanities. But he paid no attention to the merchandise, and therefore left the town without spending so much as 1 cent upon these vanities. So this fair is of ancient origins, and is a long-standing and very large fair. When the pilgrims arrived, they were clothed with garments different from any available at that fair. When the people saw them, they stared at them and talked about what manner of people they might be. Some said they were fools, others said they were lunatics, and some said that they were strange and unusual. Secondly, the great crowd wondered at their clothing, and in the same way they were curious about their speech, for few could understand what they said. They naturally spoke the language of those who have sworn allegiance to the Lord Almighty. But those who ran the fair were men of this world. So from one end of the fair to the other, the people seemed barbarians to each other. Thirdly, and this astonished the merchants, was how these pilgrims placed such little value on all the wares being sold. They didn't even care to browse, and if vendors called out to them to buy their wares, they put their fingers in their ears and cried, "Turn away my eyes from looking at vanity." And they looked upward, signifying that their trade and commerce was in heaven. One mocking merchant observed the strange behavior of Faithful and Christian and said to them, "What will you buy?" The pilgrims looked at him with serious expressions and said, "We buy the truth." With this answer, the merchant and others took the opportunity to deride the men even more. Some mocked, some taunted, some spoke with reproach, and some called for others to strike them. It turned into a noticeable commotion and grew into a great disturbance, to the point that everywhere you looked, the fair was in disorder. As a result, word quickly reached the governor of the fair. He came down right away and appointed deputies from some of his most trusted friends. He put these in charge of investigating what happened and to examine the pilgrims about why they had nearly overturned the fair. So Faithful and Christian were taken for further investigation. Those who presided over the proceedings asked them where they came from and where they were going, and why they were wearing such unusual clothing. Faithful and Christian told them they were pilgrims and strangers in the world, and that they were going to their own country, which was called the heavenly Jerusalem, and that they had done nothing to cause the men of the town or the merchants to mistreat them or to delay their journey. The only exception they could think of was when the merchant had asked them what they would buy, and they had responded that they would buy the truth. But those who were appointed to investigate the uproar did not believe them. They thought the two pilgrims were nothing more than madmen and lunatics who came for the purpose of throwing the fair into confusion. Therefore they took them and beat them, smeared them with dirt, and then put them into a cage as a spectacle in front of all the men of the fair. There the two pilgrims lay caged for some time as objects of sport, malice, or revenge from the men of that place. All the while the governor of the fair laughed at all that happened to them. But the pilgrims remained patient and did not return abuse for abuse. Instead, they offered a blessing while speaking good words for bad, and showed kindness in the face of brutal treatment. Some men in the fair noticed their example. These men were more observant and less prejudiced than the rest. They began to restrain and accuse the disreputable men for their continual mistreatment of the captives. This made the disreputable sorts all the more angry, and they flew into a rage at those trying to hold them back. They counted them as bad as the caged pilgrims, and accused them as accomplices worthy of the same mistreatment. In response, the others replied that as far as they could see, the caged men were quiet, sober, and harmless. They went on to say that many others who attended their fair were more worthy of being put into the cage and ridiculed than the men whom they had mistreated in this way. A variety of opinions were exchanged from both sides, while Christian and Faithful behaved themselves, acting very wisely and soberly the whole time. But the words exchanged turned to blows between the opposing groups, and they did harm to one another. Faithful and Christian were once again dragged before their examiners and charged as guilty for causing the disturbance in the fair. As their punishment, they were beaten unmercifully, hung in irons, and led in chains up and down the lanes of the fair as an example and a warning to others who might think to speak on behalf of the pilgrims or to associate with them. Even in all this, Christian and Faithful behaved with increasing wisdom and with much meekness and patience amid the humiliation and shame heaped upon them. With such behavior, they won several of the men in the fair to their side, although the number was few in comparison to the rest. This generated even more rage in the aggressive opponents, to the point that they sought the death of the two captives. With this, they announced, "This cage and the irons are not a sufficient penalty for what these men have done. They should die for the damage they have caused and for deceiving the men of the fair." Then Christian and Faithful were imprisoned in the cage again, until the process of the law decided what should be done with them. So they locked their feet fast in the stocks inside the cage. With their feet locked in the stocks, they recalled what their faithful friend Evangelist had told them. It helped them accept their current circumstances and to be assured that the sufferings and trials they were experiencing were exactly what he told them would happen to them. With this in mind, they now comforted each other in that whoever would suffer death, he would have the advantage. In his heart, each man secretly wished that he might be the one. But they committed themselves to the all-wise and sovereign purposes of the Almighty, and with much contentment they rested in the condition in which they found themselves, while waiting to see how they would be disposed of. When a convenient time was determined, the prisoners were brought forth for their trial, in order that they could be found guilty and condemned. They were brought before their enemies and were formally accused. The judge's name was Lord Hategood. Their indictment was essentially the same accusation, but it had been changed slightly in content. It read that they, Christian and Faithful, were enemies to and disturbers of the trading of the fair, and that they had caused commotions and divisions in the town, and had, in the process, gained supporters for their most dangerous opinions, in contempt of the law of their prince. Then Faithful answered that he had only spoken against that which had asserted itself against him who is higher than the highest. He went on to say, "As for causing a disturbance, I made no such thing, for I am a man of peace. As for the supporters who were one to us, they were persuaded when they recognized our innocence, and that we spoke the truth. As a result, they turned from what was worse to what is better. And as to the prince you talk about, since he is Beelzebub, the enemy of our Lord, I defy him and all his angels." Then it was proclaimed that anyone who had anything to say in support for their lord the king against the prisoner at the bar should immediately appear to testify and bring forth their evidence. So 3 witnesses came forward: Envy, Superstition, and Pickthank. These 3 were then asked if they knew the prisoner at the bar, and what they had to say in support of their lord, the king, and what had been done against him. Envy stepped forward first to give his testimony. He said, "My lord, I have known this prisoner a long time, and verify upon my oath before this honorable bench that he is—" "Hold on a moment," the judge said. "First administer the oath to him." So they swore him to tell the truth, and he continued his testimony. "My lord, this man, in spite of his credible name, is one of the vilest men in our country. He shows no regard for the prince, nor his people, laws, or customs. Instead, he does all he can to persuade all men with his disloyal notions, which he tends to call principles of faith and holiness. And in particular, I heard him say once myself that Christianity and the customs of our town of Vanity were diametrically opposed to each other and could not be reconciled. By this statement, my lord, he not only condemns all our praiseworthy deeds, but also condemns us for doing them." Then the judge asked, "Do you have any more to say?" "My lord," Envy answered, "I could say much more, but I don't want to weary the court with every detail. However, if necessary, when the other gentlemen have given their evidence, to avoid any lack of evidence that would allow the prisoner to go free, I will expound on my testimony against him at that time." So Envy was told to stand by in case further testimony was needed. Then they called Superstition to the stand and told him to look at the prisoner. They also asked, "What can you say for your lord the king against the prisoner?" Then they swore him in, and he began to give his testimony. "My lord, I am not friends with this man, nor do I have any desire to know him better. However, I do know that he is a very lethal person from a discussion I had with him the other day in town. During our conversation, he distinctly said our religion was worthless, and that in no way could be a means to please God. My Lord, you know very well what follows from such sayings, namely that we are presently worshiping in vain, and as a result, our sins remain. And finally, in the end, we shall be damned. So that's what I have to say. Then Pickthank was sworn in, and he began to tell what he knew on behalf of their lord the king against the prisoner at the bar. My lord, and all of you gentlemen, I have known this fellow a long time, and have heard him say things that should not be spoken. For he has denounced our noble prince Beelzebub, and has spoken shamefully of his honorable friends, whose names are the Lord Old Man, the Lord Carnal Delight, the Lord Luxurious, the Lord Desire of Vainglory, my old Lord Lechery, Sir Having Greedy, all along with all the rest of our nobility. And the prisoner has also said that if all men thought as he did, that not one of these noblemen would reside in this town any longer. And besides this, he hasn't been afraid to revile even you, my lord, who are now appointed to be his judge. He has called you an ungodly villain, and along with this, he has used many other similar and slanderous names to smear the good names of most of the nobility of our town. When Pickthank had finished giving his account of the evidence against Faithful, the judge turned his attention to the prisoner at the bar and talked to him directly. You deserter of the truth, you heretic and traitor, have you heard what these honest gentlemen have testified against you? Faithful asked, May I speak a few words in my own defense? You contemptible good-for-nothing vagrant, you don't deserve to live a moment longer. Instead, you should be put to death immediately, right here, right now. Yet, so that all men may see our gentleness toward you, let us hear what you have to say. Faithful tipped his head and said, First, let me address what Mr. Envy has said. I want to clarify that I never said anything except that what rules, laws, customs, or people are against the Word of God, these are diametrically opposed to Christianity. If I have said anything in this regard that is incorrect, please point out my error and convince me otherwise, for I stand before you ready to recant my foolishness if you can do so. As second, I'd like to address the charge that Mr. Superstition has made against me. I can only say this, that for true worship of God, there is a divine faith required, but there can be no divine faith without a divine revelation of the will of God. Therefore, anything added into the worship of God that is not in agreement with divine revelation is nothing but human faith, a faith that will not result in eternal life. And concerning what Mr. Pickthank has said, while avoiding those abusive terms I have been accused of using, I must still say that the prince of this town, with all the riotous crowd of low people and his attendants which were named by Mr. Pickthank, are more fit for being in hell than in this town and country. And so the Lord have mercy upon me. Then the judge addressed the jury, who had been nearby and listening and observing all that was said and done. Gentlemen of the jury, the judge said, you see before us this man who has been at the center of a great uproar in this town. You have also heard what these worthy gentlemen have testified against him. In the same way you have also heard his reply and confession. Now it rests in your heartfelt decision whether he should live or die. Before you decide, I think it is right that I should instruct you in our law. In the days of Pharaoh the Great, a servant to our prince, there was an act instituted that addressed the danger posed by false religion, and those who would cause it to multiply and grow throughout the country. It decreed that their males should be thrown into the river. A second decree enacted during the days of Nebuchadnezzar the Great, another of our prince's servants, declared that whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And yet another decree in the days of Darius established a period of time during which any who called upon any god but him should be cast into the lion's den. The judge waggled his finger in Faithful's direction and said, "Now this rebel has broken the substance of these laws, not only in thought, which is not an indictable offense, but also in word and deed, which must not be tolerated." Concerning the law of Pharaoh, it was made known by public decree to prevent trouble before it actually happened. But in this case, he nodded toward Faithful. A crime is apparent. With regard to the second and third precedents, you will notice how the prisoner argues against our religion in much the same way. For this treason, which he has already confessed, he deserves to die as a criminal. Then the jury, whose names were Mr. Blindman, Mr. No Good, Mr. Malice, Mr. Lovelust, Mr. Live Loose, Mr. Heady, Mr. High Mind, Mr. Enmity, Mr. Liar, Mr. Cruelty, Mr. Hate Light, and Mr. Implacable, went out to deliberate and consider a verdict. Each individual offered their private verdict against the prisoner, and they unanimously concluded that he was guilty. First, the foreman of the jury, Mr. Blindman, said, "I see clearly that this man is a heretic." Then Mr. No Good added, "Away with such a fellow from the face of the earth." "Yes," Mr. Malice agreed, "for I hate the very looks of him." Mr. Lovelust jutted his chin forward and declared, "I could never tolerate him." "Nor I," said Mr. Live Loose, "for he would always be condemning my lifestyle." Hang him, Mr. Heady shouted out. "A sorry hooligan," said Mr. High Mind. Mr. Enmity nodded his agreement. "My heart boils with anger against him." "He's a rogue," said Mr. Liar. "Hanging is too good for him," Mr. Cruelty added. "Let's dispose of him immediately," Mr. Hate Light suggested. Then Mr. Implacable said, "If I were to be given the whole world, still I could not be reconciled to him. Therefore I say we deliver our verdict and find him guilty and deserving of death." And so they did. Faithful was condemned to be returned to his prison cell, and there to be put to death by the cruelest method they could think of. So they led him away to do with him according to their law. First they scourged him, then they beat him, then they lanced his flesh with knives. After that they stoned him with stones, then pricked him with their swords, and last of all they burned him to ashes at the stake. And so Faithful came to his earthly end. Now I noticed a chariot and a couple of horses waiting for Faithful beyond the crowd. As soon as his adversaries executed him, he was taken up into the chariot and carried directly up through the clouds with the sound of a trumpet, taking the most direct route to the celestial gate. But as for Christian, he found relief during this agonizing situation when he was sent back to prison. He remained for a time, but he who overrules all things, having the power of their rage in his own hand, worked things out in such a way that Christian, after that time, was set free and allowed to continue on his way. As he went, he said, "Well, Faithful, you have faithfully professed unto your Lord, with whom you will be blessed. When faithless ones, with all their worthless delights, are crying out under their hellish plights, sing, Faithful, sing, and let your name survive. For though they have killed you, yet you are alive." Next time, Stage 7. Thanks for watching and listening.